Unrest Podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Unrest Podcast. Hope everyone's having a great day or night. I'm Madeline Green.
I'm Carter Coyle.
And I'm Caitlin Stansel. Thanks again for joining us. What is this, episode 11 now?
11.
Yeah. Getting on up there.
I'm like kind of impressed by us that we've stuck with it this long.
I know. For a bunch of procrastinators, we've been pretty dedicated.
Heck yeah.
And we appreciate our listeners. I think I saw an email we got the other day that we have hit 1,000 downloads.
1,000 downloads. That's awesome.
Yes. So today, let's start out with this question.
Okay.
What is the scariest movie you've ever seen?
Oh, that's a good one. Because you think people watching, if you're into ghosts and stuff, you're probably into scary movies.
I feel like you have to be.
Although I'm much more scared of them now than I was when I was younger.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. I used to be obsessed with all scary movies. Like, it didn't matter what it was. And now, as I've gotten older, I don't know if like your fear is more heightened or what, but I cannot watch some of them. I can still watch the classics like Halloween and Texas Chainsaw and that kind of thing, but the sci-fi demon type movies, no thank you.
When I think of maybe the scariest one I've seen, I automatically think of Blair Witch Project. And I don't even know when that came out. I was probably in high school, but it was shot like it was one of those first movies that was shot kind of documentary style with the shaky cameras. Some people were like throwing up in the theaters, and it felt so real, and it was shot like so amateur that made it more real.
Right.
And I just remember that horrible scene where they open the rag and it's got bloody teeth in it. Oh my gosh.
That's definitely the same one I remember from that movie. And so funny, when I watched it, it wasn't in theaters. I was at a friend's house and she's like, oh, let's watch this. We were babysitting her brother and sisters. And of course, scared ourselves to death and had to call my mom to come stay with us till her parents came home. So brave.
Oh my gosh. I never saw that movie, but I didn't go see it in general because I can't watch stuff that's really shaky like that. But it's funny that you said that made it seem more real, because I feel like today with so many like cell phone videos and stuff out there, it's like, it wouldn't be as impressive.
It probably wouldn't be. I would like to rewatch it and see if it's even scary still.
Or kind of like the movies with special effects. When you go back and watch them now, you're like, that didn't look as cool as I remembered it.
Those are the best. My go-to one that as a kid, it was so real is Jaws.
Yes.
Which they did an amazing job on that movie, because I watched a whole documentary on it and how that the shark, because it was in the salt water, was like deteriorating.
Really?
So they had to come up with another idea, which was that music in the fin instead of showing this whole shark. So whenever you see the whole shark, it's actually not in the salt water, because he was like falling apart in the water. So
that's a great little tidbit.
Yeah, but when you do see the shark, you're like, it doesn't look as real as I thought it did.
Nick had me watch the Indiana Jones trilogy a few weeks ago, and because I had never seen them, and he was kind of like, they're classic, you have to see them. And I love those kind of Da Vinci Code hunt down the mystery movies, and they were really good. I liked the themes, and I could totally tell where at that time those were high production movies, and the chase scenes and all that. But now watching it, they're pretty hokey and a little corny,
right? But
I can really imagine as a kid why you would just love those and how cool it must have been. Y'all grew up together, so did y'all ever see movies together?
We did, and our like scariest movie is the same one. Yes. And kind of going off of what we were just talking about, I feel like this movie's like that too. Like if I go back and watch it now, some of the parts that were really scary, like
they're still scary.
There are really scary parts, but like, okay, we're talking about The Exorcism of Emily Rose. That's the scariest movie for us.
Oh my gosh, Madeline wants to cry thinking about it.
I'm telling you, when we went to theater, we left the theater for part of it.
Are you
because
serious?
It was just too evil for me. I don't do evil.
It was like the religious evil thing that got to you.
And apparently they had a part in it where they played like a clip from the real exorcism of her, like a sound bite from when they're like in the courtroom talking about it. And that's when we walked out. We were like, this is too much.
And needless to say, let's just pause this real quick because I'm sure I've talked about it on here, but I have like extreme anxiety and panic attacks. And from years of watching these types of movies, my very first panic attack, I thought I was possessed.
Oh my God.
So I don't watch these movies anymore because they're so ingrained in my head. Like,
it like triggers you.
Oh, I can see her like crumpled up on the floor, like doing weird contortions. And I'm just like, no, give me a serial killer. Give me some blood, any of that. I'm good to go.
The part that I was talking about, though, that is like not as scary now is, remember in the movie, she's like driving and she like looks over at this car and these people's faces look all weird.
Yeah.
Like that looks fake now, but like the parts where she is like contorted on the floor. Yeah, that was the scariest part of the movie for me. And I couldn't sleep like without a light not being on for probably 2 months after that.
Thank God that we watched it together, so we spent the night together.
Yeah.
But we used to always do stuff like that. Like we were obsessed with this show called, what was that show about the artifacts that were haunted?
Oh, Hidden Temple? Not the game show. Okay, not the game show.
It was on
like Haunted Investigations or something like that.
No, but it was like, maybe it was called Haunted Artifacts. I don't know. There was 2 shows that we were obsessed with. The deal was like we'd watch them, but you have to spend the night. Like
you can't go home alone. Was that Exorcism of Emily Rose based on it must have been based on a true story.
Yeah, it was. And I think
I never
that made
saw
it scarier.
I remember the ads being horrifying.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to have to do it. I'm going to have to just do it.
No, don't do it.
Just watch it with Nick.
Don't do it.
He hates scary movies. He hates them.
That's so
And it makes me more chicken.
Well, is our story today scary or just spooky?
I think more along the lines of spooky. And for some background, I'm taking us to Old Salem today, which is not Salem, Massachusetts witch trial Salem. We'll go there one day, I'm sure.
I watched a documentary on that Salem the other day, and it's pretty interesting.
Ooh, send me that.
I will. It's really good.
Old Salem is the historic district of Winston-Salem. You're familiar with the Winston area, Madeline. I lived in Greensboro, North Carolina for 4 years. That's where Nick and I met. It's where I had my second reporting job. And the area is like a tri-city market. So it's High Point, Winston-Salem, and Greensboro. So if you, High Point, like not the cool place to live, but Greensboro and Winston-Salem were both pretty fun cities to live in. If you lived in one, you were always visiting the other kind of thing. And so I have an affinity for the Winston-Salem area. And Winston's known for like being the cigarette producers back in the day. And
nice.
That's the Winston side of things, and the Salem side of things is actually Old Salem, which is a completely it just kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, but in a wonderful way. It's again a historic district. It's like basically stepping back in time. They have all these cute shops, gardens, these original kind of bakeries, like how they used to do it in the old days, bookstores, churches, old candle making. So kind of picture like, I don't want to say Amish because it's not quite that old fashioned, but it's very quaint and really, really pretty. It was settled in 1753 by the Moravians. So Caitlin has our spook school today, and she'll tell us a lot more about the Moravians later. But basically, you should know that they came from what's now the Czech Republic, and they were persecuted for unorthodox beliefs and eventually came to the New World, like so many folks did, seeking religious freedom. So picture Old Salem as this religious community. So I found a few fun ghost stories from Salem, and I couldn't really remember any of these specifically, but I could kind of picture them because I'm a little bit familiar with the building. So the first and probably best known Old Salem ghost story is called the Little Red Man.
Oh,
that sounds, spooky.
That sounds like I would be scared to see him. There's a fairly large house in town called the Single Brothers house. And again, this is the Moravians very religious, and I'm sure would have been very strict about not living together before marriage, etc. So the Single Brothers house is just what it sounds like. It was a communal home for the unmarried men in the town. And when at one point they were excavating the cellar of the Single Brothers house in the 18th century, and the ground caved in on several of the workers. And it sounds like it kind of happened at night, which makes it even creepier. Some of those guys were dug out just in time. But one man named Andreas Krimzer was completely covered by the dirt and buried alive. And he was kind of this beloved little playful figure in town, and everybody seemed to like him and was very devastated at his death. They dug him out, and it sounds like he was still breathing but had a bunch of broken bones and died within a couple hours that night. And he was a shoemaker in town. He also did some chimney sweeping. So you kind of picture like one of those characters who everyone came across at some point. Like he's either fixing your shoes or sweeping your chimney.
Like
and
Mary Poppins.
Absolutely.
Isn't that what he did?
He was described as, that's what,
Chimney.
What was his name? Bonus for online if you tell us about looking it up. But Krimzer was described as a short little man, and legend has it that he was wearing a red jacket or a red cap when he was buried and died. So basically, pretty much immediately after his death, all sorts of ghostly happenings started to occur at the Single Brothers house. There was lots of sightings of the Little Red Man. People would see him darting around the hallways, and because of the red cap or jacket, it was one of those things that you saw out of the corner of your eye. You might see him staring at you, smiling and grinning, and then take off. Creepy, right?
How tall was he? Do we know?
I don't know how tall, but he's described as short, little, small stature. So he must have been definitely on the shorter side, but I don't picture like 3 feet, but I don't know. Who knows? But I guess distinct enough that the ghost would stand out for how small it was, but that it still looked like a grown man. And also folks who have been in that house or worked in that house, because it's been a few things over the years, say that they hear lots of unexplained noises, specifically tapping like a shoemaker's hammer. So kind of that tap, tap, tap noise. And a lot of the information, by the way, was from the Moultrie News, and apparently the Moravian archives are really thorough because they were big on writing. So, everything about his death, burial, and subsequent ghost sightings and stuff was documented even pretty early on. Now, one of the most famous encounters with the Little Red Man is described on ncghost.com, and it's about a little girl named Little Betsy. So we've got Little Red Man, and then we got Little Betsy. Little Betsy was a granddaughter of a widow who lived in the house, because apparently it went from being a single man's house to a widow's house, which is kind of sad. If only they could have all found each other. It's said that she saw the ghost, met it, and got along splendidly with him. She was deaf because she had had an earlier childhood illness, so she couldn't speak, but later she was visiting her grandmother and excitedly was telling her about this little man in a red cap who she plays with at the Single Brothers house. And the grandmother obviously knew right away, oh my gosh, that's Andreas.
Little Red Man.
That's the Little Red Man. Now, eventually it's said that a visiting minister came into town and was like kind of horrified after they had a sighting of this Little Red Man. And because it was an old Moravian building, he felt like that was inappropriate to have spiritual stuff lingering, and had some sort of exorcism and commanded Little Red Man go to rest.
Aww.
And supposedly he's not been seen since.
Well,
so I don't know, the article I was reading said, there have been legends and other stories, but apparently at least very much the sightings died down after that exorcism.
So if you need help with a ghost, call the Moravians.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The little red man is no more.
I know, but that was a fun one. And it sounds like he certainly wasn't a bad ghost, but more of a playful one. Another common haunted and ghostly area in Old Salem is obviously the Old Salem Cemetery. And I found this cute little website called Ghost Hunter Girls, which kind of reminded me of us. And they describe that there's a story that if you park your car at the gate or kind of before the gate at the old cemetery, that when you come back to it, it's that many people find their vehicle is turned around facing the complete other way, and there's drag marks in the dust.
What?
So, and another tale says that if you park too close to the cemetery, your car won't be able to start at all when you get back to it. Another kind of more morbid tale that they describe is this hanging tree at the cemetery. It's to the left of the main area. It's a huge tree, and rumor has it that the Ku Klux Klan actually hanged many victims there, and because it was really secluded. The cemetery is a little more out there, and so it was a way that they got away with their murders, and that the greatest number of sightings in the whole cemetery involved these shadowy robed figures, kind of demented KKK people coming back, or there was also apparently documented cults that practice in the area, and so there's tales that that's what the hooded figures that you always see, and that they have been seen passing through trees or headstones and vanishing into thin air.
What color are their robes when you see the ghost? Did it ever say?
But yeah, I mean, I'm picturing maybe they're too transparent to really depict a color. That's what I'm going to go with. Actually, one of the biggest stories I covered in Winston, and I didn't cover it exclusively, everybody did, but there was this really, really creepy guy who, Palazzo, I forget his name, but it was like something Palazzo, and he had renamed. Anyway, they found like bones buried in his backyard, and he was definitely like a practicing cult member. So you kind of wonder if it's still going on today. Another report out of that cemetery is that lots of soft crying sounds come from the woods, and that there's a grave within Old Salem that belongs to a little girl who died in a really bad fire. And so maybe that's what you hear, her crying. And supposedly it's impossible to light a match near her grave.
Ooh.
I thought that was kind of interesting.
That would be kind of fun to test.
I know. Yes. So that's some of the hauntings around the Old Salem graveyard. And last but not least, another area in Old Salem that's very well known for being haunted is Salem College, which is a girls' college. And apparently, and this is on nchauntedhouses.com, they say the Gramley building is the site of a library where 2 girls were killed in an electrocution accident in 1907. So that wasn't even that long ago, but they say that the girls still manifest and scream at students.
That would be so scary.
They don't sound as friendly. A student allegedly also hanged herself in the attic of that same dorm, and kind of supposedly students there today can still hear dragging and scratching sounds from the attic of her hanging and swaying.
Wow.
Ugh.
Yeah, no thanks. Another Salem College story is a young girl fell down an elevator shaft in another dorm, and people believe that her presence is still there, is still trapped, because there's been lots of sightings of that young girl in and around the elevator areas on each floor. And then last but not least, the Fine Arts Center at Salem College apparently haunted too, including a phantom pianist who plays the piano and the organs even when nobody else is around or even touching them. And that there's someone who died in a theater there and still lingers too. So, I mean, so many of the stories that we do, or even cities that we explore, have like a couple of good ghost stories, but it was just like one after the other in Old Salem. And it probably has to do with maybe how old the city is and how long ago it was settled. There are lots of graveyards, one of which has been kind of partly built over, which makes you wonder about the things we've talked about before on the podcast about spirits being trapped or disturbed. But there are just a lot of different ghost stories and sightings and disruptions in that old village. They do have like ghost tours and stuff around Halloween time, but I don't specifically remember living there and I don't remember knowing any of this when I lived nearby. But once you start digging around, you realize it's definitely part of the culture and just the history, all these ghosts there. So
it sounds like that college alone could have a pretty good ghost tour.
Right? Exactly. And all these different things that happen in an old girls' school. Woohoo. Yeah, that could be a good movie. So I hope you enjoyed our little snapshot of Old Salem. Lots of fun ghost stories there, and definitely a place worth visiting if you're in that area of North Carolina. Whether you like ghosts or not, it is a really cool town to visit, and there's a lot to do, and it's just really pretty and quaint.
And like you said, it does have a lot of history. And as a part of our spook school today, which Carter alluded to, we are talking about the Moravians.
Very cool.
So they actually wore kind of Dutch clothing. I looked it up as you were talking, Carter, because a lot of them were kind of German descent, many of the ones that came over. So here's a picture. Kind of like those milkmaid looking outfits. Yeah.
Well, that kind of makes sense because the town does remind you a tiny bit of like a Helen in Georgia, and maybe not quite that like corny, no offense, Helen, but maybe the German influence is what I'm connecting.
Yeah. So originally they were missionaries, and they were the first large-scale Protestant missionary movement. So like you were saying, they came over because they were being persecuted for being Protestants, and they were looking for, somewhere to practice their religion freely. And something interesting about them is they were kind of the first to send over not just clergy people. They wanted to send over people that kind of had like a skill or a trade. So a shoemaker, a bricklayer, those kind of things. And they sent these people over as missionaries. They weren't just here to establish a colony. And they were the first Protestant denomination to minister to slaves and the first Protestant presence in many countries. So that's something that they're really known for, is being culturally sensitive back when they first began. And two of the cities that they are known for are Nazareth and Bethlehem in Pennsylvania. But once
significant named places.
Yeah.
So obviously drawing off of their religious beliefs there for those names. But once they got there, they decided, we want a really large tract of land, but it needs to be inexpensive. And we really want to find like this kind of place to build our community with some solitude and freedom to practice our religion in peace. So that's when they moved to North Carolina near Salem. This is kind of in the Piedmont of North Carolina. They bought almost 100,000 acres there.
Mm.
Yeah. And it was on the banks of a muddy creek. I can't pronounce the name, but in today's pronunciation, it looks like, I don't know if you've ever seen the bank called Wachovia, but I'm sure it has more of a German pronunciation, like Wachovia or something like that. Okay. But it basically meant like along the water there. So the church mission was to found this religious community. Everyone contributed, so they all used those skills that they came over with to help their community, and they took according to their need. And the settlement was called Bethabara.
Bethabara. Did not know that.
Is that how you pronounce it? Okay.
I have no idea. That's interesting.
So that means house of passage. And it was meant to be a temporary settlement until they could really establish their central town. And it wasn't long before others on the frontier learned of the wealth of skilled tradesmen there. So really, it's kind of interesting. They kind of became one of the first kind of big trade areas there. because there were so many people that had skills. They weren't just coming over as clergymen to be missionaries to people in this new land. They came over to establish this kind of settlement, and they came over with skills to help others.
They were coming to stay, not just to flee for a little while. Like clearly they wanted to bring their skilled workers and stay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Funny because they do remind me of like the Amish.
Yes.
And there's a ton of Amish here where I'm at right now. So it's interesting that that type of skilled person moved up this way.
And you think of the Pennsylvania Dutch, it sounds like the Moravians were there for a while too. They had to have either ties or at least affiliations.
Oh yeah, definitely. So it sounds like a lot of those communities were, established as really self-serving communities. They could get along on their own without having to rely on other people or settlements nearby. So Bethabara reached its high point of development and population by 1766. And as the years passed, it really became less of a town and more of a farm. A lot of its purpose was to provide food for the residents of Salem. And one story I found, it talked about a black slave, Johann Samuel. And he was actually named the first farm superintendent in 1788, and he was granted his freedom in 1801 and allowed to rent land there from the church. So I thought that was kind of a cool example of, this concept that they were culturally sensitive and they wanted to help others, and, they were just very accepting, even in a time when slavery was such a big thing.
I do remember learning that at least at first, and when they came to America, they were very open-minded, and I'm pretty sure anti-slavery, which was definitely not the majority thought in America at the time.
And especially not in that area.
Right.
So, Carter, you talked about this a little bit in your story, but kind of a cool feature that you can still see today is St. Philip's Church, and around that area is a graveyard that they discovered was built over. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in Spook School really quickly. So Moravians were buried in their own cemetery called God's Acre. It was on Church Street, but law required them to have a graveyard for anyone who died in Salem. So they made a separate cemetery about a quarter of a mile up the road, and they called that this graveyard for strangers.
Okay. Original.
Yeah, so that would be slaves, soldiers, freemen, doctors, patients who didn't make it. They were all buried in this separate cemetery because they were not Moravians. And as you alluded to, Carter, while Moravians might have been known as very accepting, by the early 1800s, they had segregated the cemeteries. So they began burying the white strangers next to God's Acre, and then the strangers' graveyard became the, quote, Negro God's Acre. Yeah.
So it sounds like the longer they were here, the more influenced negatively they were and kind of giving into the pressures of racism.
That's what I was going to say. Good point.
So basically, they kind of assimilate to the times the longer they were here. And that separate cemetery kind of became exclusively for colored people. And then in 1861, the Moravians built a new church for the Black congregation along the fence line of the graveyard. In this one article I found, it said, no one knows why, but in 1890, they built onto the church, adding a room right over the graves.
Yeah, that's so weird, especially since they seem so sensitive to burial.
Yeah. And what's interesting is it was quite a few decades later, in 1952, the congregation abandoned the church and they moved to a building a couple miles away. So they used St. Philip's Church to store furniture, but soon that church kind of became ran down. The windows were broken, the roof was leaking. really, it just was not used at all anymore. And at that point, there was no sign of the graves at all. So it just kind of came like a rumor that this church was built on top of the graves. So in the early 90s, this group, the Leaders of Old Salem Incorporated, they decided, we're going to restore the church and we want to find the graves.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So they started pulling up one of the hallway floors and they found 19 gravestones.
Holy
then
cow.
They pulled up the church steps and they found 12 more. And then at this point, they knew that there were at least 131 people buried on the property, 14 under the church, but they weren't sure exactly where all the graves were located. So that was kind of one of the difficulties in this whole project that they were doing. They eventually kind of made their own mapping of the site by using some of the church records, and they were able to kind of establish where the graveyard was and those graves were. And then what's cool is in St. Philip's Church, part of the floor now is glass. And when you lean over the railing there that protects the glass, you can see 3 raised mounds of reddish dirt, and those are supposedly some of the graves there.
I do remember cool. that, but I forgot the story behind it. That's so interesting that they built over those graves. They clearly knew they were there if they were that easy to find all these years later.
Yeah.
But I do remember that glass floor now. That's interesting.
What'd you say, Ma'am?
I said, I guess they just didn't care, which nothing against, cemeteries and stuff, but I'm not sure what it would matter if a church was built on top of it. I mean, it still is a sacred sanctuary.
True.
I don't know.
And I feel like cemeteries back then, they didn't have these huge elaborate headstones.
I've seen so many crazy headstones. One was like a full sculpture of the person. I'm like, really?
Well, and you would assume that if they were segregating the cemeteries too, they probably put less effort into marking, where
absolutely
the bodies were buried in this, cemetery just for colored people that they created. So some notable people that are buried there, kind of interesting. This one man, he was a day laborer and a former soldier for the British. He was buried in the graveyard in 1780. Then there's a captain for the Continental Army. They left a sick soldier, William Brown, at the tavern. He died a week later and was buried there in 1780. So those graves that I just mentioned, under the glass floor, this article I was reading was talking about how during the American Revolution, the Moravians refused to fight for either side, but the war was still happening. So both armies still passed through the Salem area, and sometimes they left behind some of their sick soldiers.
Oh.
And they believe that those 3 mounds that are under that glass in the floor are some sick soldiers that were left behind by those armies that were passing through in 1780.
Whoa. Okay, cool. So I wonder, it could have been British or American.
Yeah. And if you actually go, there's a kind of a plaque on the wall beside the glass. You can read their stories. And then on the outside, their names are carved in the granite.
Did you see anything?
A little bit of history.
That church, did you see anything about that's where the Emancipation Proclamation was read?
I didn't see anything on that.
I could be wrong. I think it was St. Philip's. It's all blending together because it's been a while since I've been there. But definitely at one of those significant churches in town is where all the slaves gathered for the first time to hear that they were free.
Oh, that's cool.
And I know there's I think a lot of the times that happened in the Black churches all over the South. And it makes you think of how amazing that must have felt.
Oh my God, yeah.
Hear a legal proclamation like that. But
you're right. It was in 1865. A Union soldier came to Old Salem's historical St. Philip's Church with a long hoped for message for its African American parishioners. They had been officially freed from the brutal institution of slavery. And then it sounds like they actually kind of recreate this years later just to kind of celebrate that moment.
That's cool.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, just the significance that churches, many churches have, not just in the religion, but in the actual social structure, is pretty cool. And that's that's really interesting about how far back they went, even to the Revolution and stuff, Caitlin. Like, that's really neat.
Yeah, so like you were saying, that area just has a lot of history. And then if you look up pictures of this church, it doesn't look like a church you would imagine. It just looks like a little wooden cabin, basically. It's not like the churches we think of here that are really old in downtown Charleston, and they're like so beautiful and ornate.
Elaborate.
This literally looks like a little wood cabin kind of in the middle of a field.
It is true that when you think about old churches, you always think like, oh, these beautiful churches.
Mm-hmm.
So today's real life haunt comes from a friend of mine named Ginger. A few years ago, I met her and started doing some barrel racing lessons at her barn. She has an amazing barn in Travelers Rest, South Carolina. And when I first started hanging out around there, Ginger would joke when something would be out of place or in the hallway. Let's just say she kept a very clean barn, so it was very strange for anything to be out of place. And she would joke that it was the ghost that lived there. Well, it wasn't a joke, and eventually Ginger told me the pretty crazy story of this ghost. So every day she would clean out the stalls from when the horses were up at night, and it was just Ginger and another lady who helped at the barn. So they're minding their own business, getting their chores done for the day. And then, as Ginger is dumping some poop in the wheelbarrow, she looks down the barn hallway, and so does the woman who is with her, and they see a man. They were kind of surprised because, 1, they weren't expecting anyone at the barn. For 2, they never heard a car or a truck pull up, and this is like a gravelish road, so you usually hear it. And 3, the dogs never barked, which is something that they would often do when people pulled up to the barn. But she sells hay, so she thought, it must be someone coming to pick up some hay. They told him to hold on while they finished up that stall real quick, and as soon as they got back out of the stall, they looked down and didn't see anyone. They walked outside the barn, they walked around the barn, they walked around the property looking for this mystery man. And it's not like they took a long time and that he left. It was just a few seconds that they could finish up that stall, and they could not find the man anywhere. They looked at each other and asked, "You saw a man, didn't you?" And both answered and actually could describe what this man looked like. They both said he had slicked back black hair. He looked like he was in some sort of bowling shirt, and they kind of added that his outfit had an air of 70s about it. They did a little research into the land and the house itself, and come to find out there was some sort of devastation that did happen on this land. The original landowner died on the land. The police report says from suicide, but when they asked his family, they believed that he was murdered in some sort of love triangle. Whatever it is, his spirit has stayed put, and he has been known to make noises with no explanations, stuff being strewn about the barn. And so after Ginger told me this story, I thought it would be a funny joke. It was Christmas time, so I bought her some sage. And since then, the activity at the barn has definitely calmed down somewhat, but has not gone away completely. Ginger believes that the sage definitely has calmed things down, and so she dares anybody to move it from its place. So it is still there in the barn, keeping the spirit at bay. And this spirit is so popular that even a past barn manager would name it, and she called him Dave. So this is the story of Dave the Barn Ghost. Pretty cool real life spook. I'm glad that I got to be a part of that one. I had totally forgotten about it for a while, and I really enjoyed talking to Ginger about that experience again.
Well, thank you everybody for tuning in today. We love sharing the ghost stories and some of our personal stories with you guys. Hopefully you're enjoying it too. Hop on and rate us. However you listen to your podcast, give us a few stars and leave a review.
5 to be exact.
5. Yeah. Anywhere between 5 and 5 is fine.
Yes. Perfect. Maybe 5.
But thank you again for listening, and send us your stories.
Yeah, don't forget to send us your stories. You can email those at the Unrest Podcast at gmail.com, or Caitlin has the phone number because I don't know it still.
She's the only one who has it memorized. Caitlin?
You can give us a call at 843-564-2101, or, just email it to us or post it on Facebook and we can read it for you. Whatever you prefer, or you can even jump on our Zoom call the next time we record.
Talk to you guys next week. Thanks for listening.
Au revoir.
Adios.
Toodaloo.
Unrest in peace.